What is the class system in the Shire in Tolkien's Hobbit, Lord of the Rings? This is Tolkien Trivia, where I talk about weird fringe topics and unanswered questions. And this is, I guess, more weird fringe topic than unanswered question. I don't know if anyone's been begging to know about this, but it seems like an important thing, because I think when you realise how important the Shire is and the hobbits are to Tolkien's vision of the purpose of his book, when you think about criticisms of Tolkien based on his traditionalism, his classism, whatever else, and when you think about the characters that we look at, particularly the four hobbits in Lord of the Rings, it's important, I think, to investigate this further. And it certainly isn't something I've seen criticisms of Tolkien for, this very traditional view, this false nostalgia, classism, elitism, whatever, feudalism. I've also, certainly I think you can see that it's a world which is not very familiar to us. It is an audience proxy. The hobbits are our audience proxy. And the Shire is an audience proxy when Tolkien begins writing this in the 30s. It is perhaps more recognisable, at least as an idea, at that point. Now, roughly, let me just say, what do we see in terms of the people who live in the Shire and how they relate? You have, at the top, if you want to put it like that, you have aristocrats. You have two titled aristocrats. You've got the Thane, the Great Took, and you have the Master of Buckland, who is the head of the House of Brandybuck. And we have, in Lord of the Rings, we have the two heirs to those houses, Peregrine Took, Pippin, and Meriadoc Brandybuck. We see people relate to both their fathers, or at least particularly the Thane, and to the two sons when they're in the Shire, in a way that is quite distinctive. You see that Thane Paladin, he is the one ordering troops around to cause trouble for the ruffians. He is held out and led his people in holding out against the ruffians. The country is alive with our hunters. We see that Merry and Pippin lead at the Battle of Bywater. It's very particularly that it is fitting for them to lead, and for them to kind of rally troops, and the Ent draft making them of mightier stature does seem to kind of map onto this expectation of them leading their people. You see another group, another class, if you like, of we might call them in traditional terms gentry, landed gentry or whatever, and particularly I'm thinking about the Baggins, the Sackville Bagginses, maybe the Bolgers and the Boffins. Here you have people who have significant property. Bilbo Baggins has a large house. It is above a number of cottages inhabited by more ordinary folk, called Underhill. These people are leisured. What does Bilbo do exactly? He is of an independent income, isn't he? He has enough somehow, perhaps off rents or investments. The Sackville Bagginses, with their pretentious double barrel, they're taking on of a different house's name, perhaps for inheritance rights, because that's the typical reason historically for a double barrel. It has to do with inheritance rights. There's something going on there. We see them. That's one of the few significant things from The Hobbit that tells us about this, is that Bilbo at the start is a man of leisure who goes on an adventure. He has Tookish blood, an adventurous house perhaps, and of course that probably connects to why they're the Thanes, which is an Anglo-Saxon title of nobility, not necessarily hereditary. It is in here though. And then at the end we have Bilbo come back, and the Sackville Bagginses are trying to sell his things off. And then you have more ordinary folk, Samwise Gamgee, Hamfast Gamgee, presumably the Millers as well, the Sandymans, though they have property. This is one thing, there is no sense anywhere, though Bilbo presumably, if he's independent, he may have rents or something. There is no official seigneurial due, there is no feudal arrangement here, as far as I can tell. So it is a picture not of medieval Britain or England, it's not of feudal England, but of 19th and early 20th century England, and of a rural type at that. It's not urbanized. The largest villages, there's basically villages, aren't there? There is a place like Hobbiton Bywater, which has flowed in, two villages flowing into one. Maybe Mickle Delving and Little Delving. There's another kind of urban conurbation there, but none of these are particularly large. Everyone lives in villages or outside villages in the countryside. You have stately homes what's the Brandy? Is it Brandy Hall? Something like that. And you've got Great Smiles where the Tooks are, the old Took, the Great Took, the Thanes live. Now, this kind of gives us a picture of a society that is quite ordered and settled, and it's something you could think was false nostalgia, but I think when I think about a couple of left-wing authors of the 20s and 30s, 1920s, 1930s, I'm aware we now live in the 20s, there is something there that is recognisable when you read Adrian Bell, the journalist, columnist, crossword creator, and particularly rural writer of rural life, really an equivalent to someone like Aldo Leopold in America, and George Orwell, writer of 1984, both left-wing figures in many ways. You see they both recognise things about the relations between classes. They describe, by that I mean they describe things for Bell it's about rural class life and the way in which the relations between people are settled and live on the land and how they relate to people of different classes. And with Orwell, it's an idea of a socially engaged and morally responsible, albeit in his view very incompetent, aristocratic class. I think they would have looked at the Shire and seen not a fantasy, but something that looked like a positive depiction of something they saw on the land in rural areas. So Tolkien is depicting what is rapidly dying. You certainly see that with both Orwell and Bell describe that death of a former social arrangement. Already happening in the 30s. You know, it's not something the Second World War does. It started by the rise of the urban middle class in the late 1800s, by the First World War, and so on, but by the increasing importance of democracy and universal suffrage just after the First World War. All of this, I know I'm in the weeds here, but just saying it's something they see dying, and Tolkien begins writing about. And you could compare it then to Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, which is not, though it ultimately ends up really being about Catholic conscience, but he writes it at least in part because he wants to talk about the death of the country house and the death of the country house lifestyle and so on. So read that if you want another comparator. So Tolkien depicts this, and he depicts it positively. Now, does that mean he is saying that he is wholly in favour of rigid class relations? Well, an interesting thing I think is worth noting is how fluid the class relations are in Lord of the Rings, particularly. I mean, again, The Hobbit, there's a couple of points to draw out, but mostly we can set it aside. In the Lord of the Rings, what we see is that Frodo is cousins to the two leading aristocratic scions of the Shire. He himself, he is the heir to a wealthy man, but he is not himself an aristocrat. He has no great public duties. He is not the Master of Buckland. He is not the Thane of the Shire. The other great position, the Mayor, Mickle Delving, is, the Mayor of the Shire at Mickle Delving, he is elected. So there is a democratic element in this as well. On what suffrage, I don't know, that it seems presumably pretty broad, because Sam is elected to it, and Sam is from a very ordinary family. Will Whitford, I guess we don't know what he comes from, what background he comes from necessarily. But class relations are fluid. Frodo is cousins to those who are socially superior, inverted commas, to him. Now, this is something which is perfectly ordinary if you look at English aristocratic gentry history. There's a lot of fluidity. It's not the same on the continent where, for instance, you essentially booted yourself out of the aristocracy by marrying out of the aristocracy down below you into the middle class or the upper middle class. No such case in that, and that's a morganatic marriage. A morganatic marriage is not simply one to do with someone who's divorced, but to do with someone who's not of the right class. There's no rule like that with the English aristocracy. There might be implicit social rules, but there's lots of marriage and bringing up of talent and decline of particular clans and so on. And there's a lot of fluidity. And you also see that they operate on equitable terms, if not equal terms, with Sam, who's a servant. Certainly Merry and Pippin never instruct Sam to do anything. Frodo doesn't really instruct Sam to do stuff. Sam chooses to serve, but Sam goes as an equal partner, and that's ultimately proven by it is not the role or it's not the act of a servant or slave to carry Frodo and the ring up Mount Doom. It may seem like the ultimate act of civility, but it's something which is presented in the book as a mature adult decision where Sam really comes into his own and actually takes leadership and responsibility. And the final result of this is, though of course he cannot, because this is Tolkien's vision of the classes, he cannot become the Thane or the Master of Buckland, he does become Mayor. It is the case that he's able to ascend the classes in that way. So we look at the class structure of the Shire then, and what we see is not a medieval fantasy, nor do we see something very rigid. We see something which is actually a sort of social realism, I think. It may not seem like it to us because it's so alien, and it certainly may seem undesirable. We may think, well, I mean, all very well that Sam gets promoted up through the ranks, but surely wouldn't it be better if everyone had a fairer shake to begin with, and there wasn't a sense that you had big families like the Bagginses who could employ people, and then you had aristocrats above them. Of course, you'll very quickly find, simply by looking at the, I don't know, American friends, go and check out the average suburban Washington DC inhabitant, and I'm sure you'll find that these people still exist, and they exist across the political spectrum. The point is that it is a kind of social realism we see here, even if it's an alien and frankly often undesirable one to many of us. It is one that depicts a world that for Tolkien is dying, but is perhaps, you know, a depiction of the long defeat. Down long ages we have fought together, we have fought the long defeat. It is something which is a shame, he may think, we may not think, to lose. But he depicts it here in the same way that, as I say, War does in Brideshead Revisited, to show us something he thinks is valuable. And it is what his heroes go to protect. They do not go to protect an abstract Shire or abstract people. They go to protect particular people in the Shire. You see that with Sam. And a particular place. The scaring of the Shire is the fact that there is in the anarchy of war, a thuggish element has taken over the Shire. It has lent on violence and on resentment and on theft and destruction, and so much so that even those people we may find less attractive, I'm thinking about Lobelia Sackville Baggins, rises from her indignities and from her own corruption to resist them. Fatty Bolger, representative, I guess, of the gentry, leads the resistance in the north, while Thane Paladin is able, because he owns presumably so much of the land in the south, able to actively resist and hold off the ruffians. And then the scions of the aristocrats come back and chase them out with a battle where the people come together. So it is what they win. This is the Shire they win. It is a hierarchical, traditionalist, but somewhat fluid, somewhat socially open environment. And it differs, therefore, actually, in some ways, certainly to Gondor or to a degree to Rohan. Rohan, I suspect, has a lot more of that. Obvious, there's a degree of warriors advancing and proving themselves in battle. It's different to the other free nations, and very different to the elves as well, where the elves functionally have no, even in the Sindar, where there is a class structure, they have no working class. Elves are simply elves or princes. So yeah, anyway, that's something I thought was interesting, and I suppose may contribute something to some of your thoughts about the social elements of Lord of the Rings. Not to endlessly deconstruct these things, but just to understand more of why the characters act like they do, and why the world works as it is, and what the stakes of the story are for our main characters. Anyway, you tell me what you think, if this has ever struck you, you ever thought about it, if you have a different take on it. Tell me in the comments, and I'll see you next time.